Guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with my top 5 picks for spring when it comes to eyeshadow palettes. This video I've seen going around a little bit and I wanted to make my own take on this. Although we are already middle of spring, I just wanted to make this anyway because we definitely still have a few more weeks of spring, and I'm personally just now getting like very into kind of spring makeup. I have been kind of doing the winter to spring transition for the last couple of weeks, but now I'm full swing like spring makeup, although I'm wearing like a blue smoky eye today. But yeah, I'm really excited to play around with more spring colors like pastels and things like that. So I want to go through the palettes that I have picked for my top 5 eyeshadow palettes for spring. But before I jump into that, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. So I feel like I could not make a top spring palette without mentioning this one. So the first one is going to be my Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette. This is actually going to be the first spring that I have this palette in my collection because I picked this up last summer. But yeah, it's a perfect spring palette because it does have like some minty tones, like some greens. It has like a few warm tones, but also a lot of pinky mauve tones, which are really beautiful, I think, for spring. It has really nice, beautiful like shimmers, but overall it just gives a really good spread of all the type of colors I would like to wear for spring. It does have more kind of lilac shades as well, and yeah, this is just a perfect palette for spring. If I would have to pick only one palette, I think, for spring, this would be the one because it does have a lot of variety in it, and I just love this. It's a beautiful palette, and it is very hyped for a reason. So if you do have this in your collection, make sure to put it out now for spring because in my personal opinion this is the best time of year to reach for this palette. Let's just stay with Huda Beauty because I have one more palette from her to talk about, and that is my Nude Light Obsessions. I think this is a really nice more kind of, I don't know, neutral but still those tones kind of spring palette. It has like more lilac tones, like a bit of like mauve tones in there, but also a bit more kind of peach leaning. It's a very kind of light palette, hence the name. It's the Nude Lights palette, but I love this. It creates really effortless kind of looks, and personally this is a beautiful palette for spring. Since the shades in here are very light, it again leans more kind of pastel, which I really like, and the formula in here is absolutely amazing, similar to the Mercury Retrograde palette. The mattes are so blendable and like soft, but like not powdery. They're just really soft to the touch, and the shimmers are stunning. I have it pan on this shade up here in my Pandas eyeshadows, and I also really love this pink down here. It's like a pink with a gold shift in it, like almost like a gold greenish leaning, and it's stunning, and I love this palette, and it's definitely another one that I'm going to reach for now in spring. And this is a beautiful, like I said, everyday palette, so it's definitely one that you can create more kind of everyday spring pastel looks with. Speaking of pastel palettes, I had to include my Lilac You A Lot palette from ColourPop. This one is probably one of my top ColourPop palettes that I still have in my collection, and this is what it looks like inside. So you can see that you have those really beautiful, again, pastel shades. You have some lilac pastel shades. This one is a bit more kind of pink leaning, but it is still very kind of yeah, like purple leaning. You can see it right there. It's a beautiful palette. The formula in here is probably one of the best 9-pan palettes that I've found. And if you do have, I don't have this palette anymore, but if you do have the Demon to Be palette, I would also incorporate that one in this video. And you can kind of pick what type of pastels you like to go for. I prefer like these kind of pastel purple, and I do have a few mints in my collection, but most of them are now singles. So this is like the pastel palette that I would pick for my spring palette, and I absolutely love this. So if you don't have this and you love purples, I don't know what you're doing, because I love this, and I prefer it way more than the purple one, the It's My Pleasure. I actually have the color of that one, and I kept this one because I like it more. And overall it's just the perfect palette to pull out for spring. So we have 2 more palettes to go. Next up we have a palette that I will say is kind of like a good early spring palette, or like going between winter and more spring kind of makeup, and that is my Natasha Denona Love palette. This one would be perfect for February, but obviously February has come and gone, and I actually didn't reach for this in February, which is really silly, but this is a beautiful color story for spring. It has again those kind of pinky tones. It has some purples. It does have a few more kind of deeper shades, especially in this corner right here, but I don't think it's too deep for not being a spring, like to not be a spring palette. And I think you don't always have to go for a pastel look when you're doing spring looks, and this one is just, again, it does have like more kind of neutral tones if you do want to create a neutral look. Like you have a really neutral shimmer up here, like this more pinky peach shade, or like more kind of brownish leaving moss like these ones right here. But again, you have more kind of, like I said, pink shades, like this one is here is very pink. You have more purples, and I think overall this is a nice palette to reach for in spring, especially like I said when you're early in spring, or if you want something not so super pastel, not so over the top, but you still want to go for those spring tones. I think this one is a really good one to go for. And then we have come to my final palette, which is almost the other end of the spectrum, because this palette is one that I consider a spring and a summer palette, but I think it's definitely a spring palette, but it is very much kind of warm leaning, and that is my ColourPop Sweet Talk palette. This one looks like this. You can see that it's, like I said, more kind of warm toned. It has more peachy tones, but again, you have some more pastel shades, which for me is like the telltale sign of a spring palette. So you do have those in here, and obviously, like, this is a kind of, it's not a monochromatic palette, but it kind of is. Also to note, these two shades are not originally in the palette. There are two pressed glitters in there from the original palette, but I've taken those out because I like having all my pressed glitters in my singles. And these two are like similar tones, but in pressed powder form. So yeah, that's kind of the change I've done to this palette, but it is a similar vibe to the pressed glitters. It's just that it's powder shadows instead. But yeah, I like this palette a lot, and it's one that I'm definitely gonna reach for, especially like in May time, like end of April, May, because I think this is a beautiful palette, especially for those times, because it is a spring tone palette, but it is kind of like towards summer, like I said. So I would say that this one and the Love palette is like opposite ends of the spectrum, but again, it's definitely one that I'm going to reach for loads in spring. So there you have it. Those are my top 5 palettes for spring, and yeah, most of these are kind of like peachy leaning, like pastel purple, or like pinks, or like mauve tones, so all very warm toned. And I wish that I had more kind of bluish or minty shades, which is something that I also like reaching for in spring. And I also thought about including like a green palette, but again, I just wanted to do my top 5, and these palettes for me are like exclusive, or like the whole palette is spring to me. So I was for a while thinking about including maybe the Wilderness palette, but that color story is more awesome to me, but there are shades in there that are very spring. But since the whole palette doesn't scream spring to me, I didn't want to include that one. And I do have a few kind of minty shades in this palette right here, but I wish I had another palette that are exclusive with those. But like I said, I have declared my Mint to Be palette, which would probably be the one that I would include here. I do have some of those shades deposited into my singles now, and again, I have a lot of mints in my singles, but this video was only about palettes, and that's why I decided to go with these 5. So again, I have the Mercury Retrograde palette from Huda Beauty. We also have the Nude Lights Obsessions from Huda Beauty. We have the Lilac You A Lot from ColourPop. We have the Sweet Talk palette from ColourPop. And then lastly, we have the Love palette from Natasha Denona. So that is it for this video. Please let me know down below what your absolute top spring palette is. It's always interesting for me to see what people like to reach for. And my top spring palettes might be something completely different to what your top spring palette would be. So let me know again what your top spring palette would be. And otherwise, I really hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are. And I will catch you in my next one. Bye guys.